Not in my backyard. Is the fight to stop development protecting our communities or holding us back?
NIMBY is a term that covers a lot of different bases. There's certainly a lot of people who don't like change and don't accept that places change.
I think it's a term that should be embraced. I think everybody should be a NIMBY.
I feel that it has a very racist undertone to it.
Do you think Sydney needs a second airport?
No.
We've become a nation, unfortunately, that it's easy to refuse.
Renters are competing for landlords and not the other way around. We have to build more homes.
Trevor, you oppose a development in your local area, the new Western Sydney Airport. Why is that?
We just do not want to be impacted in terms of health, in terms of noise, in terms of amenity, and in terms of our lifestyle, that an airport and the operation of that airport will thrust upon us.
Will this airport have a curfew?
No.
Wayne, you had also opposed the airport when it was initially given the go-ahead. Let's see how it's affected your community.
So over there, beside the runway, that's where Luddenham is. Luddenham lost a lot of its residents to the land of the airport. A lot of Luddenham was actually in the airport site. Over there on the hill is where the old Catholic church was and cemetery there. A lot of people haven't been able to build or do modifications and things to their house. And a lot of Luddenham now, you can't, if you wanted to do a knockdown rebuild, you can't. If you wanted to put an extension on or a granny flat, well, you can't do that. There's just been this hold up with the planning for Luddenham. The last excuse was, oh, we need to find the flight paths, where that's just ridiculous because we are situated right in the middle of the runway. The flight paths don't make any effect to Luddenham because we're in the middle of the runway. So what you see out there used to be all farmland. Now look at it. My family came to Luddenham in the late 1850s. First that I remember hearing about Western Sydney Airport was in the 70s. Everybody just thought that it would never happen. It wasn't until the 80s, then we realised that Western Sydney Airport could be a threat to the town of Luddenham.
My family and I moved to Luddenham in 1983. I was aware that an airport may be built. I wasn't concerned about it, quite frankly. Values would go up, there'd be more people. It was a real win-win situation as far as I saw. The community here agreed, well, yep, the airport's going to happen, so let's make the best of it. Right now, as I see things, we have been lied to. We have been conned.
I really don't want to see Luddenham vanish off the map, and for me, saving Luddenham is a priority.
Wayne, the airport won't be finished for a few years. How do you feel about it now?
It's a matter of trying to get the best outcomes, and things are going to change from a kid as growing up in a rural area. Now it's going to be in the aerotropolis. It's going to be like a city in itself, and it's going to be a 24-hour airport.
So would it be fair to say that you're now on board with the airport?
I was very much against the airport in the early days and was the secretary of the Badgerys Creek Anti-Airport Group. But the day the government bought their first block of land, I've been in favour of the airport to try and work with the governments and the community to get the best outcome.
And the best outcome being?
It'd be nice to have a curfew, but we know that that's not going to happen, and it's going to be a 24-hour airport. But I think just to get the right development around the airport so that places like Luddenham can survive.
Trevor, the airport is due to open in 3 years. What are the options that you see at this stage?
Certainly the only thing that we can get out of this is a curfew. The assumption that governments are making about, well, we've built the airport now, you're just going to have to lump it. I don't think the people of Western Sydney will roll over and take it, and we will in fact get a curfew.
Do you have any vision for a different use of that space?
Oh, definitely. In fact, the runway that's being laid out there now will make an excellent platform for a future high-speed rail system. And the hub that could be, the transport hub that could be created around that site would be a great deal more benefit, not only to Western Sydney and southwestern Sydney, but into regional areas, because with aviation, it is a point-to-point transport system.
Do you think Sydney needs a second airport?
No.
Have you ever pushed back against any other developments?
Yes, in going back to the 70s, we had a liquid waste dump, toxic liquid waste dump, thrust upon the Castlereagh State Forest area. Then the problem caused by the Eastern Creek waste dump, and I believe the smells from that when the wind is blowing the right way still bother the people of Minchinbury.
Rebecca, you also live near Western Sydney Airport. Do you think the new airport is needed?
Yes, I do. It's brought in so many jobs in our area, and so many people live in Western Sydney and around the airport, and many, many local businesses have benefited from the construction of the airport already.
Do you feel like you were given enough information about the airport?
No. No, we definitely could have had more information. Information did change quite a lot as well. There was a long period of time between updates of information, and there were people who were going to be adversely affected, and unfortunately we happened to be one of those people when it came to zoning. We bought our property where we are now as our retirement fund. We have 3 children. We could, we had so many options. We could have built a second property. We could have subdivided. We don't have those options now. We have to look at other options. Yeah, it definitely is impacting our emotional and mental health as well.
Because of the airport being built, your home has been rezoned as environmental land. What does that mean for you?
That means that with the stroke of a pen, our property is worth less than half of our next door neighbour.
So we're looking at that map now. Your property sits in that circle, on the edge of that green zone.
Yes.
And literally half the price of your next door neighbour. So because of that line on the map, can you stay in your home? Do you have to leave it?
We have to leave. We can't stay there being zoned environmental. The buildings will be knocked down.
Can you sell your property?
Not to anybody else. No one would want to buy it because they can't build anything on there.
So the only option then for your property is what?
Acquisition.
Acquisition by the government.
Yep.
Is that the same for everyone in your area?
Not everybody in the area, no. There's just a corridor of houses that are under what is supposed to be a voluntary acquisition.
Trevor, are you concerned about development affecting the value of your property?
I think it will affect the value of my property. Is it a concern to me at the moment? Not really, because of my age, but it certainly will impact the younger families around my area and right throughout the area that's affected by flight paths and aircraft noise.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, your home will be knocked down and the block will be used as parkland. Nearby, a new city centre is being built. How do you feel about that?
We need the parklands. The airport's going to be huge, and I think having designated green spaces is a great idea. Having my house knocked down, that's going to be emotional for anybody, but progress can be good. And I think to designate that green space before doing anything else, I think is quite positive.
Wayne, what do you think about this new city being built in the area?
Well, one of the things with an airport, of course, it's going to bring lots of jobs and lots of opportunity, and lots of people will need to live in the city, and that's why Bradfield's being built. The airport is certainly already making a big difference to local businesses there, the coffee shops from the workers on the airport, and there's lots of things that are already happening there with the airport.
Sean, you live near Tweed Valley in New South Wales. A new hospital is being built about 5 minutes from your home. How will that affect you?
Well, for me, it's a totally different story. My son, Harry, was doing some physical exercise next door. All of a sudden, he just fainted and dropped down. Luckily, the neighbours were there whilst my wife was calling the ambulance and performed CPR. And it took 15, 20 to 20 minutes for an ambulance to arrive to actually help. And at that time he did need a defibrillator because it figured out he was having a heart attack. We needed a helicopter. Unfortunately, one couldn't land at Salt. There's a footy field there. And they could not land at the current Tweed Hospital because it wouldn't take a helicopter. So at that time they had to get permission from the Coolangatta Airport to land there to get Harry to take him to Brisbane. So that was an extra 15, 20 minutes on top of what was already 20 minutes of just important.
So at the moment, if your son had an emergency, what happens? Where do you need to take him?
At the moment, we have to take him to Tweed Hospital, but then it depends on the severity of the incident as to whether we have to go up to Brisbane to get further assistance.
So this new hospital is going to make your lives much easier?
Oh, the new hospital's a blessing actually to us. To have a hospital in the local area is every minute's life-saving, so it's so important.
Not everyone in your area feels as positively about this new hospital development.
We've been farming on this plateau for 7 generations now. The soil here is volcanic and very fertile. The crops really love it.
There's only like 13% of state significant farmland left in the whole of Australia. The rest has been developed on. The development of the new hospital has changed our area immensely because it's gone on the side of the plateau. It's made farmers rethink about our farming lifestyle and how that's going to change in the future with more people brought into the area.
Don't know why they had to put it there.
It's too close, ruining our farmland.
Tweed Valley is in need of a new hospital. We're not denying that. We're very appreciative of the new hospital. It's just in the wrong spot. Farming doesn't mesh well with an urban environment, and especially our hospital. You've got a lot of people coming and going, ambulances moving quickly. It's
going to change our area immensely. Kingscliff is only earmarked for 3-storey development, as the hospital's 7+ stories. It's going to open it for developers to then start putting high-rises in and around Kingscliff. We don't really want high-rises. You only have to look at the Gold Coast, and if you do want to live in that sort of development area, it's not far up the road.
Since the hospital's gone in, there's been a lot more interest in a lot of big developers turning up. They just want to make money off it, buy it cheap and develop it, and then it's gone forever. It needs to be saved for farming, for future generations. There's plenty of other areas to put residential and industrial developments on. We will keep farming here as long as we can. We will not be letting the developers push us out.
Sean, what are your thoughts about those who don't like where the hospital is being built?
My thoughts are, I hope that nothing ever happens like happened to us with Harry, an incident, a life-saving incident, that you will then understand how important it is to have such a facility within the community. Of course, Harry's a one-off, but there's certainly other health issues that are very life-threatening, and that people need to have that security and knowledge that that safety net's there for them.
Trevor, people opposed to new developments are sometimes called NIMBYs. That stands for Not in My Backyard. Have you ever been called a NIMBY?
They use the term NIMBY as a derogatory term. I think it simply highlights the fact that a lot of people who use the term do so because they don't know a lot about the people who are objecting or the issues that they're objecting about.
Eamon, you're the head of an advocacy group promoting the growth of Sydney City. What does the term NIMBY mean to you?
NIMBY is a term that covers a lot of different bases. You know, we've got people that don't want to see environmental degradation happening. I've got a lot of sympathy for that. You know, we want to protect the natural environment. So saying they don't want to see that loss of natural environment in their backyard, I can see that and I can appreciate that. But at the same time, there's certainly a lot of people who don't like change and don't accept that places change over time. And the reality is living in an urban environment, living in a city means living in constant change. And that's something that's really tough for us as humans, as an emotional level, as we've heard tonight. Change is hard for people, but change is inevitable if you're living in a city.
Are you sympathetic to those who are against developments like airports or hospitals?
I can certainly empathise with it. I don't have a lot of sympathy where those objections centre the outcomes for a small number of people against the outcomes for a large number of people. I mean, the reason why we need to build an airport or a hospital are for large-scale opportunities and improvements in people's lives. Western Sydney Airport, Tweed Heads Hospital, these are things that are going to transform entire communities. Thousands of people's lives will be impacted, jobs will be created and the like. And we need to balance that out against the impacts on particular people. Now, of course, it's always challenging because the impacts felt by a small number are felt incredibly keenly, incredibly deeply, whereas the impacts, the benefits, are felt in a much more diffuse way.
Marilyn, you live in Bunbury in Western Australia. In June this year, you got a letter outlining a proposal for an apartment block near your home. What details were in the proposal?
The developer owns an existing 5,000 square metre block, which is underutilised. It's become underutilised. And so his development that he wants to build now is a 54 apartment, 3-storey block there with 140 car parking bays, a shop and room for a cafe as well. So the development per se isn't problematic. It's the scale of the development that we're objecting to.
And what did you do when you got that letter in the mail?
So I had 24 hours to get the objection in before it closed, and then I've since then spoken to council to find out what the process will be.
And what are some of your other objections?
One of the other objections is we're in an old part of Bunbury, so we're only about 1.5 kilometres from the CBD. We're adjacent to a heritage area, and so one of the big issues that we're putting forward is around parking, but also traffic.
The proposal is for 54 apartments. Yeah. Are you opposed to having more people living in the area?
No, not necessarily. It's really the issue of traffic. He's got 140 car parking bays as part of the development, enclosed on a mezzanine and also some underground. So that means incredible amount of traffic on a T-junction, and one of the roads of that T-junction leads into a heritage area, which is really a very, very narrow road.
It sounds like the car issue is a big one for you.
Yes, yeah.
Not having as many cars in the area.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you mind me asking if you've got a car?
Yes, oh yeah.
Have you ever been labelled a NIMBY for your opposition to developments like this?
Not really, because I've not really been, it hasn't been that close to home, so it hasn't been in my backyard. So we haven't had a lot of development in the area.
You successfully stopped a development literally right behind your backyard. What was being proposed?
We back onto industrial, so it's a giant block of land, 12 warehouses on the back of the block, and on the front of the block a petrol station, and with a 24-hour drive-through that was supposed to go right along our back fences, and also with a restaurant.
What were your specific objections to the proposal?
Light pollution, noise pollution, amenity, residential amenity, concerns for the environmental impact, and also safety, because we are also located near an airport and that petrol station was underneath a flight path.
Before you moved into the area, did you know that it was zoned as industrial?
Yeah, we did. And there was a big business running over the back of us, but at the same time, the businesses that exist sort of ran during work hours, not on weekends, and we really had not heard much from them. We felt that our amenity was preserved.
You led the fight against this development. What sort of meetings did you have with the developers?
So I think community was key. So I think we certainly championed the fight against this, but we did really get our whole community on board with petitions and all sorts of things. But then we did go through the process with council. So we had council meetings, we had community consultation meetings with developers, and then we went through to VCAT.
VCAT being the Victorian Civil and Administration Tribunal?
The tribunal. So we did go to court. So that was, quite a process.
And what was the VCAT outcome?
They refused the planning permit for the petrol station. The warehouses wasn't about refusing that planning permit. We knew that was going to happen. The developers actually took the council to VCAT. That was around some issues in terms of hours, but we felt it was a really fair outcome there. But certainly the petrol station was the one that we were most concerned about, so we were quite pleased.
Digby, you moved from Sydney's northern beaches to the New South Wales south coast 2 years ago. What was behind the move?
A number of things. The crowds, the busyness, the traffic. There's a saying that, Sydney will be a great city when it's finished.
Why do you oppose developments in your area?
Where I live now, we're opposing developments because they're called what's generally classed as zombie development. So the approval was granted many, many years ago under different planning laws, under different environmental regulations, and now 30, 40 years down the track, developers are wanting to use old environmental planning laws to actually force through new developments.
So what specific developments are you kind of up against at the moment?
There's one at Kalala Bay where they're trying to clear out a whole lot of native bushland. It's home to at least 2 gliders that are under threatened species. We've got that down at Huskiston. We have a development that wants to demolish a church that has architectural and historical significance, and also an Aboriginal burial ground.
Given the housing crisis, where do you think the balance is between protecting the environment and building more housing?
We actually have to build houses where people need to live and want to live. So the housing developments down my way, they're on coastal areas, they're in small coastal towns. You actually have the community of Nowra, the city of Nowra, and that's where you can actually put developments. You can revitalise the township and not denigrate the environment on the coastal areas. People go down there for holidays. I went down there to live because of the environment, because of the natural, beautiful environment. And if you destroy what people want there, then it destroys it for everybody.
So physically, in your view, where can people build?
I think in cities. I think cities are a good place to build. And there are townships where you can build the social housing. There are townships where you can build affordable housing.
What would you say to people who say to you, well, when your house was built, didn't it destroy some of the environment?
True. Oh, look, 250 years ago, there was a whole lot of natural environment that's not around anymore. And that is true. It depends where your house is built and how it's built. We have areas of environmental significance. And if you start developing on those, then you actually will start to, we start to lose so many more species, flora and fauna in our country.
And let's say we're building in Nowra, you're building maybe in car parks or in already existing structures. What happens when those areas run out of room?
Nowra is a township that could probably triple in size, in all honesty, I believe. It's a large enough area. It has a lot of open space within the township. Nowra, South Nowra, North Nowra, Bomaderry. There's lots of communities where you can actually do development down there, and still for many years.
Have you been called a NIMBY?
Yes. A number of times, and for many years, yes.
How do you feel about that?
Oh, look, if you live in an area and you think it's a good area, why would you not try and keep that area as you like it or improve it? I think that's the natural human reaction. If I like my area, I think it has natural beauty or great neighbours, I'll try and keep that because that's what I want to do.
Marilyn, what do you think of the term NIMBY?
Look, I think it's a term that should be embraced. I think everybody should be a NIMBY. I think when we think about the fact that we are now confronted with limits to growth, the idea that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet's been around for many, many decades. And it's there, we know what's happening with climate change, we know what's happening with deforestation, species loss, etc. And yet we don't seem to bring this into the conversation and say, well, what are the limits to growth? And then if we are setting those limits, how do we want to manage what we've got? How do we do that in a way that isn't just driven by short-term profit? And that's what I find most distressing, is that there doesn't seem to be any thoughtful, intelligent conversation with a move towards consensus. It seems to be driven exclusively by profit.
Eamon, what do you think of concerns like Digby and Marilyn have?
I am troubled by them. I find the idea that we get to stop things now that we have our opportunity, now that we live in a place the place can't change, is not really fair. It's not fair to the people that don't have a place to live in that community. And I am troubled sometimes when we think it's okay for me to own a car, but I don't want other people to be able to drive on my roads. I can understand the very human experience that we have about the love that we have for the community we live in. But we often don't hear from the voices of the people that don't get to live in that community because they don't get to have a place in that town.
John, far north Queensland has been your home for more than a decade. What happened after you separated from your partner last year?
Well, I was a stay-at-home dad for a number of years with a home-based business. I was active in the community, had a market stall. Due to separation, I was ended up living in a caravan park for 5 months, paying $260 a week to pitch a tent during the wet season in far north Queensland.
So what was it like trying to find accommodation prior to living in the caravan?
Housing up there is very hard. There's not a lot of apartments and most of them are priced quite high for the local wages. We get a lot of southerners coming up for kind of climate change shifts and they can outprice the locals. We also have a lot of visa seekers looking to extend their 88 days so they can live in Australia for another 2 years. So there's a lot of competition for a very small area.
So when you were looking for housing, you were competing against different groups of people, you're competing against migrants?
Yes, it's the mecca of everyone wants to go there, especially this time of year. It's warmer up there, so there's a lot of competition for housing and I was constantly getting knocked back and people kind of prioritise the short-term, happy-go-lucky kind of visa, very happy people over me.
How do you feel about immigration in general?
Oh, I'm a lefty, have been for a long time. So I grew up in Sydney and kind of really love it. But up there, I've really had to burn the brunt of high immigration. So I'm homeless.
You recently left far north Queensland and headed down to Brisbane. Where does that leave you right now?
For 6 months now, I've been living in the back of my ute, illegally camping around in different areas. It's illegal, so I have to kind of move around and hide where I live.
So you find places to park?
Yeah, I try to park in different spots. I leave early in the morning so no one sees me, or I arrive late at night. Limited showers. It's illegal, so I have to hide from the police, otherwise you get a move on notice.
What do you do for work, John?
I'm a professional environmental rehabilitator. I restore and promote and protect environmental land, and I have been doing that for 10 odd years. So the entire time I've been homeless, I've gone to work 5 days a week.
Do you qualify for social or emergency housing?
No, most housing is prioritised towards more minority groups, so single parents with kids or disabilities or newly arrived migrants or even people fresh out of prison get preference over to a single white male.
We've heard from others here who don't support new housing developments in their neighbourhood. Where do you stand with that?
I'm 100% pro-development. We need more kind of high density housing, less greenfield, low density, 4-bedroom houses that actually chew up more environment. We need to start kind of consolidating housing and building more high density. We need to make use of the infrastructure in the schools that are already there, and I hear this word amenity chucked around quite frequently, and that's just the visual aspect. So we're prioritising the visual aspect over people without homes.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
So the amenities are what a building looks like, so overshadowed. If you've got a house full of streets, the NIMBYs don't want a tower block in their street. It changes the amenity of a place. But for growing regions, we need more housing. And you can put a family of 4 on a single block, or you can build an apartment block and house 20.
What effect has local opposition had on your ability to find affordable housing?
It's made a father who's no longer a father. My kids used to see me every day, and now I can't even live in the town where they are. So it's ripped the family apart, and it's taken me out of the community that I was in.
How long since you've seen your kids?
I moved to Brisbane 2 months ago, so I haven't seen them in 2 months. I tried to do a video call every Sunday.
Marilyn, what runs through your mind when you hear stories like John's?
Oh, look, I don't see it as a binary. I don't see it as either or. I think absolutely I've got no objection to good quality housing, medium density high density. I think it's fundamental. But I think we need to look at what's driving it, what's driving the developments that are going ahead. Is it social housing? In this case, I think social housing would be perfect in the block that I'm talking about, or at least some co-located social housing, some housing where people are encouraged not to have cars. So I think it's around about the conversations and the planning that needs to happen, not we shouldn't be having houses or we shouldn't be having any kind of high-rise.
Fabrizio, you're a developer. You've worked on residential projects around the country. What's the process of getting approval for a new development, let's say a medium-sized apartment building?
It's pretty consistent across the country in the sense that there are certain zoning controls. So there's two paths to that. There is a rezoning process, and if it's a rezoning process, the way it's typically done these days is probably done more on scale, driven by local governments and or state governments. It used to be more spot rezoning, but that has become more difficult with time. And there's a process to sort of have a piece of land that may have been industrial or residential zoned to a new zoning, whatever they think is appropriate. But if we just take a zoned piece of land, there's a development approval process. So that's typically a process that takes somewhere between 3 and 5 months to develop a concept. It then takes, depending on where you are in the country, it's quite different. In New South Wales, it's probably the worst in terms from a time perspective, but it could take up to 12 months, if not longer, in terms of getting that development approved. And then obviously there's a whole design and documentation and sort of construction process. So it's, in terms of a medium-scale development, it's a gestation period of about 5 years.
And are communities consulted during that time?
Yeah, so my experience is communities are consulted. So especially in the medium density and high density world, or developments of a certain scale, community consultation has become a requirement, if you will, and there are specialist consultants that sort of lead you through that process. I actually think that community consultation of developments of a certain nature, should be part of the process, because it is a way to be able to understand what the community has in terms of concerns. You can't allay every single concern, but you are also able to communicate what your vision is for the project. And look, it's not 100% of the case, but I'd like to think that by far and away the majority of situations of reputable developers doing these types of developments, they actually want to leave the community in a better place.
Does community opposition affect that process?
Of course it does. It does in the sense of it's easier to say no to something, and I think we've become a nation, unfortunately, that it's easier to refuse than to sort of be accepting and I suppose come up with a better solution.
When you look at solving the housing crisis, is NIMBYism holding us back from that?
Look, NIMBYism, depending on which variant you wish to take, there is a proactive consultation that should occur in terms of what is good for the community, and there are certain periods of time in which that can occur. Just being obstinate for the sake of I just don't want it in my backyard, I think that definitely unfortunately hurts the ability to sort of grow a community.
Developers are often accused of being greedy and killing local character with unattractive high-rises. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a shame that it gets to that. I can understand why it may be said. The developer is taking a risk in terms of delivering a product, and it's also their brand that they're putting on the line as well. And I'd like to think that, again, the majority of developers who are proud of their brand are about brand building and adding to the community and leaving it in a better place so they can continue to do more things as well. There are examples where that hasn't been the case as well, and we should call them out. We should have no shame in calling out bad development, and there has been plenty of examples of that as well. But that shouldn't stop good development actually occurring.
Can the drive for profits mean developers might not always have the community's best interests at heart?
Yeah, so from a profit perspective, I think it's really important for everyone to understand that a development, financially to make a development work, you need your own money and you need debt funding as well from banks and other financiers. To be able to make a development stack from a feasibility perspective, there are certain returns that must be met from the bank's perspective for them to give you their funding. And it's typically accepted across the whole of Australia and really the world that the bank would expect you to make somewhere between 18 and 20% as a margin on cost that you are actually expending. So that's going into a development. Now, as we all know, and as we've seen in the last 3 to 5 years in Australia, we've had construction costs rise by 30%. So quite quickly, those margins can erode. That's the risk of the developer. No one sort of steps in and says, hang on, that's unfair, let us help. Of course, there are circumstances as well where the developer might do better because the sales market might go in their favour or some economic event may sort of suit them as well. So there is an upwards and downwards movement to that margin, but typically a developer tends to make somewhere in that range.
Eamon, you live in Sydney. What's been your experience with housing?
Currently, I live in a fantastic freestanding house on a very large block, about 3 minutes walk from a train station. It's about 20 minutes into the city. So I kind of have the Australian dream. I get the best of all worlds. I have proximity to a great job, to all of the amenity that you get from that, but I don't have to share it with anyone else. But that's not fair. It's not fair that I get that sort of level of amenity and other people sleeping on the streets, sleeping in the backs of utes. I'd also note that the downside to such a low-rise and low-density area that I live in means that it's a pretty dull suburb. There's one little cafe and there's one little corner store next to the train station, but other than that, there's nothing really going on. There's certainly nothing going on at night, no restaurants, no bars, cafes, nothing that makes my community fun. If I want to go to the shops, I've got to drive. If I want to, despite the fact that I live in relatively inner city, I've got to drive to the shops to see friends, to get to a good park. Basically to anything that makes for a good life, I've got to hop in the car. So I would welcome more development in my local area, apartment blocks next door, apartment blocks across the street. They've just built a big dual occupancy across the street from me. And that will mean that there will be a greater number of people within walking distance of my town. That'll mean that that town will potentially have enough customers for businesses to start in that area, and that will mean more opportunities for me.
Is NIMBYism directly affecting housing supply in your view?
NIMBYism is absolutely having an impact on housing supply, and we're in a housing crisis right now. Sydney is maybe the 4th least affordable city in the world, and that's hollowing the city out. It means that cleaners, teachers, nurses, cops, fireys, people that we definitely need to make our city work can't afford to live in our city. On a very basic level, the average income in Sydney will not buy you the average house in Sydney.
Jonathan, you're the lead organiser for the group called NIMBY in Melbourne. That's Yes in My Backyard. You advocate for more housing. How should we go about that?
I think one of the clear messages that NIMBY groups sort of around Australia are putting out is that we need to build up, not out. You know, we need to preserve our natural environments. We need to ensure that the impact we are having is minimised on the natural environment and homes are built where people want to live. We're in this case where renters are competing for landlords and not the other way around. We have this scarcity mindset around housing, and we have to build more homes where people want to live.
What are your thoughts on the community consultation process that's run by local councils?
Part of the problem inherent in the community consultation process currently is that it privileges a very select number of voices. It privileges people with a lot of time on their hands. It privileges people who have an understanding of legal bases, or at least the time to kind of get across a lot of really esoteric planning laws that have been built up over years and years and years and are incredibly difficult to navigate. But most importantly, the community consultation process locks out a really key voice, and that's the voice of people who want to live in a place but are unable to, whether that be because of affordability, whether that be because of lack of supply. Those people don't have a voice in these processes, and when you have one block where 30 homes will be built, but maybe there's 6 neighbours who are speaking out against it, you end up with this weird trade-off where actually 30 people are being negatively affected by this outcome should this development not be built, but that trade-off is invisible.
Would there ever be a housing development in your backyard that you wouldn't want?
I don't think so. I think, broadly speaking, I try to live my principles. I think the reality is we will see better housing outcomes if we see broad upzoning, if we see medium density being able to be built across a lot of the city. A lot of the bad outcomes, or the outcomes that people perceive to be bad, a lot of these bad outcomes come up because we have sort of this spot upzoning process where individual blocks are the only bits of land available to developers, and as a result they really have to maximize the use of that land. What we see is that if you allow medium density across a larger swath of land in the inner city, you'll actually end up with much more amenity because you'll end up with this kind of consistent neighbourhood fabric.
Eamon, are there times when NIMBYism might be helpful?
Having opposition to growth, having opposition to change is a really critical part of the conversation about how we change. So NIMBYism can be helpful because it makes decisions better. and it really tests and sharpens the change that we want to see in our cities or that we will see in our cities. So it can be helpful, but I think that element of not in my backyard can sometimes be the challenge, because intrinsic in that is I'm okay with this in someone else's backyard. So where it is saying, look, I think this is a bad idea because I have worries about this for anybody, not in my backyard, not anywhere, that's an interesting conversation to have. If your argument is just to say, can't somebody else deal with this problem, then that's not a very good place to be starting in terms of a reasoned and adult discussion.
Raquel, you live in Parramatta, an area of Western Sydney that's been the focus of multi-billion-dollar developments.
Yes.
How do you feel about the pace of change in your neighbourhood?
I actually really love it. I love living in Parramatta. I've lived there my whole life. I think we need development in Parramatta, but unfortunately we have heard that the light rail is going through Parramatta. They knocked down the Royal Oak Hotel, which is a very historical 200-year-old hotel, and that was to make way for the light rail, but the light rail doesn't go anywhere near where the pub stood. So this is a huge, massive mistake that this old pub has been knocked down for absolutely no reason. All that's left standing now is the old coach house. I think it's just like a token gift to the Parramatta community that, oh, look, there's still something there that's heritage listed. But that pub was 200 years old. That's one of the oldest pubs in Sydney or Australia. That was one of the last beer gardens in Parramatta. So even though we have development and we need high rises and places for people to live, we also want to go out somewhere. We don't all want to just sit in a cafe sipping a latte. And tradies that live in the area, they want to go somewhere and have a beer after work, or when you go to the stadium and watch a football game.
Why do you feel it's important to keep heritage buildings in place?
Because we just don't want it to be a concrete jungle. A lot of the old heritage buildings in Parramatta were sandstone. A lot of the old little workers' cottages have been pulled down for development. I think if everything was just all brand new high-rises and brand new shops and brand new cafes, it would be a very boring area to live in.
Jonathan, as a YIMBY, you're pro-development. What do you think about heritage concerns?
I can't comment on this exact pub, but certainly building by building heritage can make sense in a lot of circumstances. But the reality is that heritage restrictions often impose costs that actually make it very difficult to maintain a building, keep it safe, keep it accessible.
Have you fought against heritage protection?
Yes, absolutely. We had a win recently in Maribyrnong where 900 single-family homes were going to be locked up under a heritage overlay that would sort of preclude development. We see restrictions on the potential growth and the ability for a community to change as inherently problematic, especially in a housing crisis where we are prioritising, from our perspective, infill and city-based development.
Sue, you're a heritage consultant. What value is there in maintaining heritage buildings?
Heritage buildings are the physical representation of where we've come from, our history, our character. I don't think that the number of heritage listings that we have in any way is responsible for our housing crisis.
You advise local governments and people who own heritage properties. Is maintaining these properties making it harder to increase the housing supply?
I don't think it is, because say for those vast areas we're talking about, the 900 houses, that's quite exceptional, I would think, and that would be what we call in New South Wales a conservation area. So you might want to conserve the character of that area. But those houses are not kept in aspect. You can do alterations to them, but you wouldn't be able to, for example, go and put up a high-rise in that particular area. But there are other areas that could be utilised.
Eamon, what are your thoughts?
I'm very supportive of heritage on a site-by-site basis. It's a lovely old pub in Parramatta is something that would have really contributed to the character of Parramatta. But there are entire suburbs in Sydney, like Haberfield, where you cannot change the housing that's there. Are we to say that we've locked that up and we will never change Haberfield? The rest of the city has to take its fair share of growth and change, but Haberfield never has to be touched again. That doesn't seem fair. That seems like a very, very clear articulation of a NIMBY approach to growth. It is saying we want growth, but not in this backyard, and indeed not even in this suburb.
Rowena, As an Aboriginal heritage consultant, you give advice about the Indigenous significance of an area. What does this idea, not in my backyard, mean to you?
I feel that it has a very inherent racist undertone to it that doesn't acknowledge my heritage. It doesn't acknowledge the Aboriginal heritage of this country. It doesn't acknowledge how ancient this place is, and I think it's quite limiting.
What are your thoughts on those who are trying to, say, protect the communities they've lived in and their families for generations?
I do sympathise on a human level, but I also do support development and co-development, especially for Aboriginal people. I believe in our right for self-determination in these spaces, and I feel that if development is done ethically, there are the parameters and the legislations around heritage, around environmental impact.
When you hear about a building that's, say, 150 years old or 100 years old, and you compare that to how you view your land, what are your thoughts around that?
There are many sites that there's dual heritage. I do acknowledge people wanting to protect their heritage, but I do feel that it is a very small speck in terms of protecting Aboriginal cultural heritage. Science has us now at 65,000 years plus. Aboriginal people and our perspectives and our ability to protect our cultural heritage, those opportunities only started in the 1970s. So when you're talking about sandstone buildings and heritage places, the sandstone escarpments and sandstone areas are where Aboriginal engravings were. So there was mass and multiple desecration to Aboriginal sites to create these heritage buildings. So I think it's a sort of, it's a no-brainer for me. I think there was lack of respect and a lack of acknowledgement for our cultural heritage and our cultural values.
Eamon, we've heard the conflicting concerns about heritage, culture, immigration, housing, stress. What's the solution? How do we determine what to prioritise?
A lot of the conversation, it feels like people not being listened to on either side. One of the things that I think we really need to be doing is to be starting with a conversation with the community before we get down to the granular level of individual developments. If we all have a say on how we want our cities to be changing, acknowledging that they will change, how the things that matter most to us, the trade-offs we're willing to accept, that then don't get into a street fight, it's lot by lot battle, but actually agree on some generalised principles and then get on with the job. The key thing we need to deliver is a lot of houses. In the housing crisis we have right now, we need to be building a lot more homes for a lot more people in Australia.
Can we afford to disagree?
If we do it quickly, we can afford to disagree. As I said, I think disagreement sharpens and clarifies good outcomes. It's not something that we should shy away from, but we need to do it in ways that are sensible and not intractable.
Trevor, who do you think are the best people to decide what is right for their community?
It seems to me that the key issues are the engagement process, the consultation process, the understanding of the other person's position, and whether that be, in my case, with the airport, where there was no consultation until after the decision was made to go ahead, whether it's the heritage issue, whether it's some of the Aboriginal cultural issues, no matter what the issue is, if we've got community involved, well, I think that's when the decisions that are best for everybody will evolve with an understanding between people who might otherwise be totally opposed to ideals expressed.
Rebecca, your plans for the future were changed overnight with an arbitrary line on a map.
Yep.
Your home was designated environmental land next to the new Western Sydney Airport. You don't seem bitter about that decision. Why do you think that is?
I'm not bitter about the decision. Progress is good. We do need the airport. It could have been me, it could have been somebody else that it happened to. But I think there needs to be a little more fairness around it when I see my next door neighbour, their property is worth more than double what mine is just because of that stroke of a pen. There needs to be a lot more open communication around that.
Do you know whether you will stay in the area?
I would definitely like to stay in the area. I want to open my own business in the local area. I'm born and raised there, my family is there, and I definitely want to stay there in the area.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. You can catch up on this episode or any others on SBS On Demand. I look forward to seeing you next time.